There you go. Brave guy. Okay. I live in Overland. I live in Overland. Is that right?
What?
You doing the camera?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tired.
Brian, pull over it for you, huh? Hey, we can move that one guy. Hey, Greg.
Do you want it to be taller?
Okay, I think we will go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody to the 28th Civic Luncheon Lecture featuring here. We do this each month. Those of you that haven't been to one before, this is during the fall and spring semester. Next month, we have confirmed Brigadier General Dr. Chris King, former academic dean at the United States Army Command and General Staff College in Leavenworth, and he's going to share information from the Defense Department perspective on climate change. And he has spoken around the world and comes highly recommended. So put that on your calendar. It'll be the second Thursday in October. Should be a great talk. This event today is funded by the Dean's Office here at Kansas State Polytechnic. And the purpose of our Civic Luncheon Lectures are to engage students, faculty, staff, and members of the community, and those viewing on Access TV on important topics of local, regional, and national interest. Last April, with support from the Spirituality Resource Center, we invited Musa El-Bayoumi, who talked about Muslims in American society. Our topic today is a New Jersey rabbi in Kansas. Rabbi Moti Reber grew up on the East Coast. He's lived in Kansas since 2007. He lives in Overland Park and is the executive director of Kansas Interfaith Action, a statewide faith-based justice organization. Today, Rabbi Moti will talk about his background, some of the dynamics around Jewish identity in the U.S. and in Kansas, and also interfaith justice work he's involved with. You have note cards on your table that you can write down questions, because we're going to have plenty of time for questions and discussion. And we will also have I'll circulate the microphone and you can just ask your question if you want. So please welcome Rabbi Moti Reber.
So I wanted to, I have a whole little conversation that I do about Kansas Interfaith Action, but I was asked to talk a little bit more about the dynamics of being Jewish. So I'm going to give you a little bit, about 10 minutes of autobiography. So I am third generation American. So my great-grandparents were the ones who moved here, and they came in the great immigration of the late 19th century. Hundreds of thousands of Jews moved from Eastern Europe to the United States. My wife's mother came through Chicago. Actually, I think they came through Texas. My people came through New York. So we had a New York story, Lower East Side, the first generation in the tenements. Then when they get successful, the second generation, the kids move to the Bronx or to Brooklyn. And then the third generation, the immigrants live in Lower East Side. The first generation lives in the Bronx. And then the second generation lives in New Jersey or Long Island or whatever, sort of hopping out of the city. The history of Jews in Eastern Europe is not a happy one, very suppressed in terms of achievement. So when they come here and there's no legal impediments, there's some social impediments, but there's no legal impediments, they thrive. So also in those days, New York had free tuition. So Bernie Sanders did not invent the idea of free public university tuition. The City College of New York was free tuition. And that was a leg up for that entire generation, who then became very well established in the US. During that period, there was social segregation of Jews. There were some people, like in Kansas City, there were some places Jews couldn't live. There were some clubs they couldn't belong to. This is hot. I'm whistling. There were some, for instance, if you're familiar with Kansas City, there's a place called Menorah Hospital. Menorah Hospital was the one that the Jewish doctors put together because they couldn't work in the other hospital. So that kind of thing. There were quotas in the universities, in the Ivy Leagues, and there was a lot of anti-Semitism in the country, which was part of the anti-immigration. Partially, anti-Semitism is a kind of a time-honored tradition, but also there was a great deal of nativism in the United States at that time. No Irish need apply is the example that people remember. So when I work now on issues having to do with immigration, or particularly the Muslim community, I say that the things that are being said about Muslims right now are the same exact things that were said about Jews 100 years ago, that we were unable to assimilate, that we were, whatever. I don't think they say they're dirty like they did with us, but Muslims are pretty clean, generally speaking. I think that's recognized. But that we can't assimilate, that we're not Americans, that we can't accept values. I mean, all that stuff that we heard 100 years ago. And that sort of went away. Anti-Semitism became very unacceptable socially after World War II. Actually, in the build-up to, I don't know if any of you are history people, but in the build-up to World War II, there was a huge native isolationist, semi-fascist movement that Charles Lindbergh was involved with in the 30s that kept us out of the war. In the 20s, we had a major immigration bill that basically dried up Eastern European immigration. So the people who were stuck there were the people that got killed in the war. After the war, a lot of the social limitations were swept away, and then Jews became what we are now, which is very prominent in all areas of public life. So that's kind of matchbook sociology right there. So I wanted to say a little bit about denominations. So I want to say a little bit about denominations, and I'm going to swing back to anti-Semitism a little later. So basically, there's a term I'm going to give you, which is called halakha. Halakha means Jewish law. So everybody say halakha. Okay, so I sometimes use the word halachic as an adjective. So that's halakha. It's Jewish for Sharia. So Orthodox people, in the old country, there weren't really denominations. Germany had denominations. Germany was the one that had formed Judaism because they were the most modern European country vis-a-vis the Jews. But when you think about like the shtetl and the old country, you think about Orthodox people who follow the law as it's been brought to us. When Jews came, during the Great Migration, it was the period of the melting pot, or the assimilation, the imperative to assimilate, right? So not having a separate identity, not being ghettoized or cloistered or self-segregated, but being part of America. And that's also a reaction to the history of being forcibly segregated in Europe. So there's this whole story about Jews throwing away their religious objects in the harbor in New York. They wanted to be Americans. So there's a large degree of secularization that happens during that time. But if we start from Orthodoxy, which is sort of the baseline, what you think of when you think of sort of Fiddler on the Roof type Jews, those guys are Orthodox. The Americanization, both philosophically and practically, conservative is a more modernized version where they say that they still follow halakha, but they're modern. And halakha can move faster and can be changed faster. It's very hard to change halakha in the Orthodox world. In the conservative world, it's easier. And then in Reform and Reconstructionist, these are non-halachic. So they don't base their Jewish identity or their Jewish practice on Jewish law, more or less. I mean, so these are two kind of categories. So I grew up conservative. My grandparents were secular. They didn't want to, they were the kind of people who saw the Jewish practice as passé. So, but my parents moved to the suburbs, and they wanted to raise us Jewish, and they wanted us to get a Jewish education. So they they established a synagogue and raised us in that setting. So I was in a public school, and went to supplementary religious school in the afternoons. And it was 3 days a week in those days, which is unheard of nowadays. So anyway, you don't have to feel sorry for me. I overcame it. So a couple other things I want to say is that an important concept in American Judaism is what we call tikkun olam, which means repair of the world. Tikkun olam. It means repair of the world. So when you think about Jews being involved in social justice, they're coming from a place where we were oppressed, therefore we know what it's like to be oppressed, therefore we are going to work against oppression of others. And that is a very core element of the identity of most American Jews. Like if you say to many American Jews, non-Orthodox Jews, what does your Judaism mean to me? This term will come up. So if you think about Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, which is a great example, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, the 3 civil warriors who were killed in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 2 of them were Jewish and 1 of them was black. Right? So really integral to all, and the labor movement and the feminist movement. If you look at the movements of social justice in the United States, basically from the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, Jews are all over the place. So I am growing up in a suburban conservative atmosphere, conservative in the Jewish sense, not in the political sense. My people are liberals from way back. And I have to say that my father's was a space salesman, which he sold time for television commercials. Very kind of middle-class life. This is achievement. This is like what we always wanted, was to be comfortable, because in the old country it was very hand to mouth. I kind of reacted to that. I never really liked that value structure. This is part of also my psychology vis-a-vis my father. But I kind of reacted to that as being, you don't know how to be in relationship with people except for through achievement. And also I discovered, so conservative Judaism is supposed to be halakhic, which means we're supposed to be observing things like kosher and Sabbath, but my people didn't really. Like the rabbi did. This is actually a critique of conservative. Well known is that it preaches but it doesn't practice. So I rejected the whole thing. I was very kind of dogmatic, and I was done. So I secularized in my late teens and rejected the whole thing. In my 20s, I was living in New York. I went to college back east. I was living in New York, and I had a need for a spiritual practice. I've always kind of been of a spiritual bent, and I've experimented with Eastern traditions. Never really flirted with Christianity very much. Theology never really appealed to me. We can talk about why that is if you care to during the question and answer time. This comes up in speaking engagements in churches quite often. So I started to get back into my religion, and there was a guy, Rabbi Avi Winokur, who was the rabbi at a Reconstructionist congregation in New York, and I took a class in what is Reconstructionism. And I don't want to get into this too much because it's too complicated to do in the amount of time that I have. But Reconstructionism is a American invention. It's an offshoot of conservatism that holds that Judaism is the evolving civilization of the Jewish people. So it's not theological. God didn't give it to us. We were the ones who invented Judaism. And since we did, we can also have it adapt to changing conditions. So for instance, the inclusion of women in spiritual leadership is a value that we maybe didn't have previously, but now we do, so we can include it. So we balance what we learn from Jewish tradition with the application of our contemporary values. So theologically, I guess it would be a sort of it's not quite Unitarianism. It would probably be a Jewish cognate of UCC, sort of, if that makes sense to you. So an evolutionary idea that we are in control of what happens. Previously they didn't realize that they were evolving. Now we are aware of it, so we can push it, we can direct it. And then also a naturalistic theology, which is that God is not a person looking down at us and making demands, but rather is that force, that spirit within us that makes us better. That, why would people in a world where all of the incentives are to be manipulative and bad, what makes us want to be good, that is God. That spirit within us that wants us, whatever force it is that wants us to act positively in the world. We call that godly. So we could think about this as, rather than saying God, we could think about godly. And I don't tend to get into theology too much. I tend to think that all theology is metaphoric. So we're always saying God with quotation marks anyway. Anybody, that's all that God language is metaphoric, because we are not, our finite brains are not capable of understanding the infinity of God. So we're always talking in language that's dumbed down for us. Okay. So I moved to, I'm going to push through this a little bit because I want to get to the next thing. I moved to Israel in the late 90s and was an English teacher for a couple of years. I met my wife there. She's from Kansas City. We were both English teachers in Israel. I lived there for 4 years and then went to seminary. And I went to the Reconstructionist seminary because that really resonated. So I got ordained in 2004, and then I've bounced around pretty much since then. I served 3 years in Naperville, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago. And then I had worked for the denomination while I was in Philadelphia. Philadelphia is where the seminary was. And so I worked for the denomination as a kind of a staff person, and I liked organizational work. And pulpit work is difficult. I don't know if you've ever met anybody who's worked in a pulpit. It actually is difficult for Christians too. They demand so much. They ask so much, and they're always keeping score. So it's not a great. And also, I have a big mouth, and I tend to want to be prophetic, and I'm not necessarily into that. I kind of like, I have this whole voluntary simplicity thing. So those of you who remember maybe conscious consumption, which is something that kind of comes out of my reaction to my childhood. And Naperville, Illinois is a very high-end area. It's kind of Johnson County, and I'm telling them, I'm saying, you don't need an SUV, and that's not what they wanted to hear. So after I got out of that, I decided to go back. It was also during the crash, and I decided to go back into organizational work, because I figured with a big R in front of my name plus some organizational experience. I had been a junior staff member at the place I was before, so I was hired to go. I was hired by Jill Docking, actually, to become the Jewish Federation director in Wichita. So the Jewish Federation is like a secular arm of the Jewish community. They raise money to support Jewish infrastructure and to send money to Jewish communities overseas. So it's a fundraising position and a kind of a community organizing position, not religious. So I learned how to do a budget and how to talk to board members and all that kind of stuff. And I did that for 3 years, and then we moved to Kansas City, and I didn't have a job when we moved to Kansas City. When I was in Wichita, a woman named Eileen Horn was starting an organization called Kansas Interfaith Power and Light, which was the state chapter of a national organization that was working on a religious response to climate change. So climate change was becoming a big issue at that time, and there were some people in Lawrence who were trying to put an organization together. So she asked me to be on the steering committee, because I was the Jew, as I often am in such settings. So I was on the board. I was on the steering committee. It was not its own organization. It was a program of a different organization. So I was on the steering committee during 2008 and 2009. Then I moved to Kansas City and quit. And in 2011, she became the sustainability director in Douglas County, which is Lawrence. She's now a state representative, actually. But she left her job, and then so the job was open, so they hired me. So I've been doing what I've been doing in one way or another since March of 2011. So I became the director, and because of my because of the politics of climate change at that time, and also because of my sort of personal predilections, we focused our work on the legislature. Is that my timer? Initially, they were doing sort of weatherization on housing. Excuse me, not on housing, on churches. So that was their focus, was weatherization. I felt that we needed to be more forward about the politics of, or the policy of climate change, so that's where I focused things. And the first thing that got any press was we testified against the Keystone XL pipeline in Topeka in the fall of 2011. And in 2012, I took my board, or the committee, to Topeka just to sort of, we had a legislative agenda that I had sort of pulled out of my hat, and we went to Topeka to sort of just do a dry run of what it would be like to do lobbying visits. And while we're sitting so we went up to the House gallery after we were done, and we're sitting, and on the floor that day while we were sitting there, they put an amendment on to wipe out the renewable portfolio standard. So I don't know if you guys remember this story, but the renewable portfolio standard was a policy that said that 20% of Kansas's energy that utilities used had to come from renewable sources. And it was meant to boost the wind industry, essentially. And the Koch brothers hate it, right? Because they hate wind in general, but they hate it. They hate mandates. So one of their legislators tried to overturn this thing from no hearings or anything, just on the floor. And we happened to be sitting there, so it was kind of crazy. So the next 2 years, 2.5 years, we spent on that campaign to save this policy. Because of course, by this time, you'll forgive me to sort of express it this way, but the elected officials in Kansas the elections in Kansas had essentially gone down the toilet, and we were under an ultra right-wing dictatorship? Probably too strong a term, but so we put a coalition together that was us from the faith perspective, Sierra Club, Kansas Rural Center, Kansas Natural Resource Center, Farmers Union. I think I'm missing one. But it was basically, we called it Kansas for Clean Energy, and it was a coalition to work on the RPS issue. And we worked in sort of parallel to the wind industry people, because the wind industry was involved in this too, but they didn't like us too much. They didn't want to get too close to us, we were dirty hippies, and they didn't like that. They wanted to be the adults in the room. But we were running a grassroots campaign to save this policy and to use it as a leverage to have a conversation about climate change, which nobody in state government wanted to have. So we were actually able to win for a couple of years. There's this one particular time when we thought we were going to lose, and we lost in the House, but we won in the Senate, like surprisingly. It was one of the greatest moments, of our work there. In 2015, that policy, the 20% has already been superseded. So the wind industry decided they didn't need the policy anymore, so they gave it up. We had a year where we were working on the Clean Power Plan, which was the federal plan in the Obama administration to demand that states lower their carbon emissions, which the state legislature wanted to outlaw us complying with it. So we fought that off for a year. Then the Supreme Court sort of stomped on that, and that was the end of that. So that was 2015. So since then, there hasn't been any meaningful energy or environmental policy in Kansas. They happily don't talk about it. Brownback likes to try to take credit for wind power, even though he had almost absolutely nothing to do with it. He did not support the overturning of the RPS, but he didn't oppose it either. He kept out of that, and he likes to take credit for wind power, which we could be doing a lot better than we are if there had been a little bit more eco-devo sort of focus on it. All right, anyway, so that puts us in 2015. So in 2015, that had all happened, so we weren't seeing any action in the legislature. Now, I also realized that we did not have, so in some other states, there's statewide multi-issue advocacy organizations from the faith perspective. So one of them is called, so like National Council of Churches. So North Carolina has a National Council of Churches. In Texas, it's called Texas Impact. And the Interfaith Power and Light chapters are programs of those bigger organizations. So we didn't have anything like that in Kansas. You may know that religion in Kansas politically has been used as a cudgel by the right wing, right? For years, the entire conversation about faith and public policy has been owned by the right wing. But there's thousands of people in Kansas whose faith doesn't reflect, like who come from a social gospel background or who come from, mainline churches don't by and large believe in that kind of ultra conservative economics policy or the endless focus on abortion and homosexuality as being the only issues that matter, or welfare reform, which is essentially taking away people's food for the sake of some policy, pretending that that's a religious policy. So that space was completely open. There was nobody doing that work. I had spent the last 4 years at that point traveling the state. So usually what happens is I'm in Topeka. I'm a registered lobbyist. I'm in Topeka during the session. After the session, I travel around the state and talk to pastors and people of faith and everybody else about what I do and try to build support. So since I'd been doing that already anyway and I had these relationships, we figured that was a good space for us to be in. So we, in the fall of 2015, we reincorporated. Also, we lost our fiscal sponsorship. Our fiscal sponsor had tax problems. So we had to spin off anyway. So that gave us a chance to think about what we wanted to be and what we wanted to do. So at the end of 2015, we reincorporated as Kansas Interfaith Action with a broader mission, which is based on the three evils that were delineated by Dr. King. So Dr. King had what he called the triple threat, or the three evils, which are racism, poverty, and militarism. That's how he called them. We call them racism/discrimination, economic justice, violence, war. We're thinking about how to say that, and climate change. So we added one because we felt like he would have been okay with that, given that how important the issue is. Plus, it's a legacy issue for us. That's how we started. We consider it a very vital moral issue. So anything that comes in the state legislature that's within any of those categories would be something that we would work on. So the first year, I mean, the first year is 2016. We announced it on January 1st. The legislature starts January 7th, so we go right into it. So we need to learn all new issues, all new committees, new allies, whatever. The first things we did in 2016 was we testified against a bill that would have made it illegal to bring in refugees. So Governor Brownback had a executive order that supposedly outlawed the resettling of Syrian refugees in Kansas, and the legislature wanted to legislate that. So we testified. It was me and Micah Kubik from the ACLU, and Catholic Charities put in written testimony. And it was an hour of Islamophobia, 45 minutes. It was an hour long. It was an hour and a half long hearing, an hour of which was Islamophobia, like all this crap about, who these people are, and there's no vetting of refugees. I mean, you've heard this whole story. Just really awful. Then they gave us 15 minutes, and they cut me off after 3 minutes, right? Because just getting to the point where I was like, there's a really significant racial component to this, and when they saw that that's where I was going, they stopped me. When I got home that day, so there's two of us against this, this thing. I got home that day, and there was a call from National Catholic Refugee Resettlement Agency saying we want to get involved. So by the end of that week, I was like, great. By the end of that week, there was a statement signed by 149 local and national organizations against this thing. So it was really instructive because this is where the faith piece comes in kind of spiritually. We don't, you can't, I don't know whether I expected to win or what winning would even look like. The bill got out of the committee, passed the House. It got squashed. But it shows that if you put in energy to standing up for what's right, you don't know what's going to happen. Things could happen that you don't predict or don't know could happen, but they won't happen if you don't stand up. So the Keystone XL was like that too. Like, who thought the Keystone XL was going to get stopped, right? But they put out for it, and then things happen that multiply the power. But you can't start without standing up and saying this is wrong. So that was really, really illustrative to me. The other thing I did the first year was we testified about welfare reform, which is basically of public assistance, which apparently is considered a poverty alleviation measure. I don't know how that works. I also know that that's not. I've read the New Testament, and that's not what Jesus said. So I went and testified, and I kind of gave them the whole thing, and I got in an argument with one of the religious right-wing legislators about. He gives me this quote from Thessalonians about if you don't work, you shouldn't eat, which apparently is greatly taken out of context. So I actually made the papers for argument with this guy. So it's not usually useful for me to get into biblical arguments with legislators, but what I do is I'll say that everything that I say from a policy point of view is direct. How many? Let me get a sense of who's in here. So, any Methodists in the room? Okay, don't be shy. Don't be shy. I love Methodists. All right. What else do we have? Catholics? Any Catholics? What do we have around here? Catholics. Okay, good. Unitarian Universalists? Mennonites? Any Mennonites in the house? Okay. What am I leaving out? Lutheran? How many Lutherans? Okay, good. Okay. So anything that I say from a policy point of view is directly out of the statements that are made by these denominations. I do not do anything that would not be in the Book of Resolutions or from the UCC, Justice and Mercy people. All straightforward. Welfare is supposed to be don't make it worse. It's pretty straightforward stuff. So I say, these are what these religions say. These are the people who are paid to apply religious teaching into public policy. I'm just representing that position. So the second year, so that was the first year. The second year was this year. We worked on Medicaid we worked very, very greatly expanded. Medicaid expansion, campus carry was a big deal for us, which is, there was nobody else working on it. We kind of either feel like we need to be the religious coalition, the religious part of a coalition, or we need to be the prophetic voice. We worked on revenue stuff. We worked on, what else? We had I think I testified about 10 different issues. Immigration, there were a couple of Kobach bills that we fought that didn't get passed. One was about enforcement of immigration laws during traffic stops, and one was making it illegal for cities not to enforce immigration laws during the course of the regular policing, and we managed to get those. They didn't go through. There's not really a lot of appetite in the legislature right now for that kind of social experimentation. Plus, I don't think there's too many people who really want to do Chris Kobach any favors in the state legislature right now. But anyway, so that's the perspective has changed. So just really blossomed. The need for what we do is there. We've really been able to be hugely effective given our paucity of our resources. And if you ask, if you're involved in different organizations, the legislators all know me. A lot of people around the state know who I am. so if we're basically trying to do a lot with a little. The other thing I want to touch on before I move to questions is the Kansas People's Agenda, which coalition that we put together of all different groups, not necessarily kind of from all different perspectives, because we had this experience of like trying to do demonstrations at the Capitol and having it be 15 people, and it's kind of pathetic. So we said everybody who's got an issue that's broadly in the social justice, racial justice area should come in the beginning of January. So we had a big rally in the state legislature. It was 750 people in the Capitol. So how many people was anybody there? Well, you guys were there, right? Very powerful. And that's something that we're continuing to build on. We just had a big event in Topeka where Reverend William Barber came into town. We had 1,000 people in a church in Topeka about moving conversation into economic justice, racial justice, and he uses the same four evils that we use. He calls it systemic racism, systemic poverty, the war economy, because we spend so much money fighting these pointless wars overseas instead of putting money into our own, into our infrastructure, into the well-being of our children, and also economic. They call it environmental destruction. We call it the ravages of climate change, which are so evident right now in the paper. You know, everything that Al Gore said 20 years ago is coming to pass. You know, the bigger storms, more impactful. These are all interconnected because where is the refineries built? They're built in communities of color, right? The people who can't get away from the hurricanes are poor people. The hurricanes are bigger and stronger because of the climate change. The damage that's done when the refineries blow up or spill or whatever is done to communities of color and poor communities. These are all interconnected issues. We can't. What's happened in the last 20 years or 30 years is that all these issues have been siloed. So there's a ton of single issue organizations working each on their individual issue and no sense of collective power, of collective interest, but also the idea of building collective power. So that's what we're focused on, is trying to bring everybody together to realize that all of these issues are interconnected. If we don't deal with all of them, we don't deal with any of them. I think that's good. Let me think about something. Let me think for a second. Okay, so if you're excited by what I'm talking about, I have a sign-up sheet in the back. We send out emails, pretty regularly, mostly sort of news stuff, maybe a couple times a month. During the legislature, there might be action alerts. And then also, if you were really moved by what I'm saying, we do not get any support, financial support, from the Koch brothers. They asked, but I said no. So if you are moved by what I'm saying and you would like to, this is really a hand-to-mouth situation. I mean, I'm going around the state basically hoping that the resources will appear. So if you like what I'm saying and you'd like to help us out financially, I would really appreciate that. I think we're doing good work, and you can make out your checks to KIFA, K-I-F-A. All right, I think I'll stop there and let you ask some questions. Are we doing cards or are we doing microphone?
Okay, if you want to write a question down on a card and hold the card up, we can pick it up.
If you're a conservative, write on a card. If you're a liberal, you can just raise your hand.
If you raise your hand, I'll circulate the microphone.
All three faiths, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims. Is there anyone in the room that did not know that? I think this is a pretty smart group, but some people don't.
Oh, that reminds me. He wanted me to talk about anti-Semitism. So let me So I mentioned earlier that I have always said that Islamophobia that is happening in the country now really sounds like the things that were said about Jews 100 years ago. So there's a uniqueness to anti-Semitism, and there's a similarity in anti-Semitism. So people have, I'm sure that if I asked you what your conceptions of Jews were like, everybody has preconceptions or prejudices about all kinds of different people. The white supremacist, white nationalist movement that's becoming more visible in the country right now is they're racist and they're anti-Semitic. There's a lot of trauma in Jews about anti-Semitism because of our history. There's a lot of Holocaust trauma. So Jews tend to be very sensitive to anti-Semitism, and I think rightly so. But we also have to recognize that the hatreds that we see, you know, some guy goes to the Overland Park Jewish Community Center, he wants to kill Jews, and he ends up killing a couple of Methodists, right? Somebody goes to kill Muslims in a bar in Olathe, and he kills a Hindu, right? There's a lot. These hatreds are interrelated. They come from the same place, and you know, the lesson is not just that violent right-wingers are stupid and they can't tell one person away from each other, but the hatred is all inclusive. So there's a tendency on the left to discount anti-Semitism because Jews are perceived to be in a position of privilege. But that's a dangerous thing to do because it puts Jews on the defensive. It makes them more wary of other people. The only way to solve this issue is collectively. This is another place where all of the issues really come together. That's what I kind of want to say about that. Oh, card. How can you claim to be hugely effective? Effective how? And are you truly affecting your 3 focus areas? Well, I mean, I guess it's all relative. You know, we're able to be part of a group of people that's doing important work, moving the conversation back from the abyss, I'd say. We didn't get campus carry stopped, but they didn't put guns in hospitals. You know, that's a kind of a, you know, that's not what we wanted. It's not what we were asking for, but we did. You know, it's always with legislation, you get and you lose. Because we had put so much pressure on them, the NRA wouldn't give in on the campuses, but we got the maximum on the hospitals. Right? KU Med wanted a bill just on KU Med, but all the community hospitals got included in the exemption. Medicaid expansion didn't get passed, but it was 3 votes short of an override. You know, I can't take credit for that. There was a lot of people involved in that, but we were part of that. You know, we managed to stay. You know, 2 years ago or whatever it was when we were IPL, we managed to stave off this repeal of the RPS until the RPS was no longer necessary. Right? It's a very strong message across the country that the Kochs couldn't get a policy that they considered that they had a very high priority in their own backyard. You know, they wanted to overturn this policy. It took them 3 years to get it overturned. Meanwhile, the policy was no longer necessary. But we were able to show that they could be fought off in their own backyard. Now, the dynamics of the state have been that we have largely been playing defense for the past 5 years, just trying to keep our fingers in the dike. That has changed to some degree because the legislature is different, but we still have the same governor. So now we're trying to, this is the first year that we've been actually able to start having a positive conversation about policies we'd like to see, as opposed to just stopping things we don't want to see. Now that conversation hasn't really, you know, we're still in a situation where the leadership is very conservative, that things don't always get hearings, they don't always get to the floor, but we have relationships, we're building grassroots engagement, And you know, I'm hoping that that's going to show. I think it's already shown some positive effect, and I think it's going to continue to.
Question over here. What do you see happening in regard to DACA in the future? Which is the Dreamers situation.
I mean, that's a very that's a moral issue, right? So DACA, I mean, this is as clear-cut a moral issue as there could be in politics. I mean, these folks were encouraged, they were required to apply and give their information. They came out of the shadows. There are people who did not, who are here contributing. We just met a guy it's actually Kansas City, Missouri, but he's a guy who's been here since he's 4 years old. He owns a coffee shop. He's an employer. He's a taxpayer. You know, they pay taxes on their payroll. They can't get they don't get refunds. You know, they're not eligible for ACA. There's a lot of things they're not eligible for. And then to say that we're going to prioritize deporting them, you know, you can't. It's hard to imagine a clearer-cut moral issue. So in terms of the policy, I don't know what's going to happen because I don't know if the Congress seems to be completely broken. Whether they can pass anything, there's still there's still quite a number of sort of right-wing Republicans who can't afford to be who feel like they can't afford to be pro-immigrant. I don't know there'll be a bill. I think that there might be, you know, there's got to be disruption. I mean, what's happening now is we're seeing a lot of street-level engagement, like the Women's March, and these town halls, right? There's a lot of action to the legislature, and I think calling our congressional delegates about DACA is very important. But there's also kind of fervor in the population about some of this stuff, and this is going to be one that's going to get a lot of attention also. I think that we need to make sure that the government realizes that this is an unmanageable policy, that we'll disrupt it if we have to. We'll try to overturn it, but we'll disrupt it if we have to. And it's not going to be something that we're just going to sit back and say, you know, we're not in control of this. We don't have anything to say about this. We'll act on an escalating fashion about this and other issues too. We're anticipating through the People's Agenda and through what's called the Poor People's Campaign, we're anticipating a season of civil disobedience in the spring, where we're trying to change the conversation. Instead of, this is kind of a meta issue about politics. We've lost the imagination of making things better. Our imagination is very incremental, like the ACA. Fix the ACA in this way or that way, you know, moving in 5-yard lines. We need to be asking for the big things that we want: universal access to health care, universal coverage. That's a big one. You know, an end to racism. I mean, how can we, you know, to systemic racism? And what are the policies that are going to get us there? We move in that direction instead of sort of doing the short game. We need to do a little bit of the long. And the way to do that is by engaging people who have never been engaged in the politics before. You know, when we think about the working class, all this talk about the white working class and sort of the post-industrial, the working class now is home health care workers and nurses and you know, people who work in hotels and people who work, you know, that's the working class. And those people are disengaged because nobody's ever asked them to be engaged. So one of the things that we need to be moving towards is engaging people who've never been engaged before. and to ask for free, free college tuition in community colleges, or addressing that issue, the fact that you can't afford to get a college education without leaving school with a huge amount of debt, even state schools, right? You leave with loans and a huge amount of debt, which limits your potential, limits your flexibility and your ability to explore and build and be an entrepreneur, whatever you want to do. You're stuck with these. You have to get a job that pays your loan. So these are things that we can see that the economy has forgotten most of the people in it. Most of the wealth that's been developed over the last 20 years has gone to the top. Meanwhile, everybody else is a couple of paychecks away from destitution. Look at Houston. Houston. Somebody's in Houston. They're working a day job. They get some stuff. They get a house. A flood comes along. They don't have flood. That destroys all their stuff. They don't have flood insurance. That's it. They're done. We should not be always so close to the edge. We have a very wealthy country. We can afford to care for each other. And we've had 30 years where we've been told that there's scarcity. There's not so much to go around. But there is. And if a billionaire is less of a billionaire so that your kid could get through college, that's okay with me. I don't know what the question was.
We have time for questions, 5 more minutes. Rabbi Reber's making some strong statements, so I'm sure that you have some comments or issues you want to mention.
What's a clarification? Sometimes I get lost in the labels. So when I see Kansas Interfaith Action and when I see Kansas People's Agenda, I'm not sure what's what.
So Kansas Interfaith Action is my organization. It's a 501c3 that organizes around the faith-based issues, right? Kansas People's Agenda is not an organization. It's a coalition of a number of different organizations that came to multiply their power. So Kansas People's Agenda doesn't really exist except as an organizing principle. Does that help? Well, Reverend Barber, so if you don't know William Barber, you should go look him up. He's like the premier kind of religious activist, religious progressive in the country right now. He spoke at the Democratic National Convention. He was here recently. They're trying to do 40 days of actions in 25 red states. So he was here because Kansas, we've already been organizing in Kansas, so they're not starting from scratch. But specifically focused on racism and economic injustice, trying to have 40 days of actions in the springtime between Mother's Day and the end of June, I think it is. So keep posted on that. If you're on our email, you'll find out about that. We're not exactly sure what that looks like right now. Right now, the next thing for People's Agenda is we'll do another rally in January. And then after that, we'll start planning for the campaign. But there's going to be tens of thousands of people in 25 states, red states across the country, disrupting business as usual to try to change the conversation around racism, poverty, and the war economy and climate. So keep posted on that, because we've always felt like we were powerless because it's a red state. But there's a lot of wiggle room even in a red state. Yeah.
How do you think that the increasing secularization and the people, even if they're spiritual, they're dropping out of institutional religion, how does that impact your organization, especially in terms of young people? How do they learn to organize?
Well, it's an issue. It's an issue politically, but it's also an issue spiritually. I mean, people are leaving religion because their churches don't respond to their values. Churches are so afraid of losing their few remaining members that they don't want to say anything. And that's not what people want. Also, religion itself has come into disrepute because of its reputation as being basically the bastion of hatred. I mean, there's a lot of hatred that comes from religion. So, we say faith and conscience. We say people of faith and conscience because we know there's a lot of people who are alienated from their religion but still feel connected to values. So we want to include those people. We don't necessarily want to come from churches exclusively, but we want to touch those people as well. I think spiritually it's a problem because religion is important. I mean, spirituality is hardwired into the human being. Religions are technologies that have been developed over eons to apply spirituality in a community setting. And if we just say that we're not going to do that anymore, then we've lost that knowledge, which I think is it's bad for the human being. It's bad for the people involved. I mean, I understand why it is, but so my feeling is, and I've said this to churches, is that we're giving people their religion back. Like, we're taking back the message that's actually in the Gospels and bringing it back into the church. Which I think they've lost to a great extent. Now, we don't always get, there's a lot of politics inside churches. Now, I have been not invited to many churches, even mainline churches, because they're afraid of controversy. But I don't really try to make a church do anything. I'm just trying to reach people. But I think that if you hope, the other piece of it is that the decline of religion is part and parcel of a concerted effort to split us apart, right? Because all of those things that civic organizations, churches, all the things that brought are now no longer. And that's part of keeping us isolated, atomized, and consumered, to keep us consumered. So that's, I mean, just being part of a community is almost countercultural at this stage. But I also think that the work can't be done in the individual church. I think the beloved community that Dr. King spoke of is all of us. You build community in your church. You can build community in your church, but the real work is done with all of us coming together. We had an event in the legislature this year that was called Stand with Muslim Neighbors Day. And we had 200 people there. Probably a third of them were Muslims. The rest of them were Christians and Jews. That's very powerful. Standing together, saying that we're not going to allow our neighbors, our friends, to be victimized and villainized. That was the second best event that I've ever done. The first one was the RPS thing. This one was the second one. And I really feel like it's the interfaith piece is the most important piece. Because we all share these values. We differ in our practices, but there's values that we share that we can't do on our own. Your pastor, even if your pastor was the most visionary, prophetic person in the world, there's only a limited amount of things you can do within the walls of your own church. But if we can get all of us together, that's a power. And that's what we're trying to do. Thanks for asking.
And I want to thank all of you for sharing this noon lecture. And Rabbi Modi, let's give him a round of applause. Next month we have Dr. Chris King, so I hope many of you can put that on your calendar, and we'll see you then.